my name's Darren and welcome to the Maker's Rage podcast. So this is the first episode in a series I'll be doing on the Muses, this being a podcast ostensibly about creativity. I thought it would be interesting to look at the ancient Greek Muses in a retrospective way, examining how our attitude, particularly in the West, has evolved over time, not only towards the 9 canonical Greek Muses, but towards muses in general. There are gods and goddesses and presiding spirits of the arts and crafts in every culture, but in this series I want to focus on the concept of the muse as it was conceived in ancient Greece. After all, the word muse, or musa, is Greek, deriving from an Indo-European root meaning to think, and it's still part of our lexicon in the 21st century. Though today we rarely use it to refer to the 9 daughters of Zeus and Mnemosyne, and for this reason I'll be focusing less on these and more on how our understanding of muses has evolved over time to the present. What is it to be a muse? The ancients would say one must be female, immortal, divine, a daughter of Zeus as mentioned, deigning to bestow her afflatus on servile male supplicants. Fast forward a couple of thousand years, in Belle Epoque Paris, a muse can be a prostitute, lying naked on a bed, very mortal, daughter of a nobody, unlike the gentleman artist with a private income, who has the leisure to go stalking the streets of the demi-monde in search of a pretty face he deigns to immortalize on a canvas. The irony of using painting as an example here is that, interestingly enough, there is no ancient Greek muse of painting. But I do intend to devote a whole episode at the end on 10th muses or missing muses, modern or postmodern muses. But despite my decision to use the canonical 9 Greek muses as a framework to structure the series, I do intend to both celebrate and interrogate the very concept of a muse in all its historical iterations, from one of its first and most celebrated in Homer. Sing in me, muse, and through me tell the story of that man skilled in all ways of contending. That man, of course, being Odysseus, the wiliest of the Greek heroes, to Dante's veneration of Beatrice, a woman he knew in real life, and who friend-zoned him hard, to Shakespeare's Dark Lady, whom the author didn't quite venerate, describing her as having eyes that are nothing like the sun, with black wires growing out of her head. Not very flattering, but as Shakespeare said, I grant I never saw a goddess go. My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. He was certainly more flattering about his patrons, especially a certain pretty boy, Henry Wriothesley, 3rd Earl of Southampton. Lord of my love, to whom in vassalage thy merit had my duty strongly knit, to thee I send this written embassage, to witness duty, not to show my wit. He then goes on, of course, to show his wit, but the previous sonnet 130 isn't his most popular. You can't imagine any woman being wooed by having a poet say, and in some perfumes is there more delight than in the breath that from my mistress reeks. And then after saying other things like he'd rather hear music than listen to her speak, he finally ends the poem by saying, and yet, by heaven, I think my love as rare as any she belied would false compare. In other words, here are all the ways you're a harridan, but I love you. But I suppose what he was trying to do is better expressed in a sonnet he wrote long before, or at least was sequenced a lot earlier, sonnet number 21. So is it not with me as with that muse, stirred by a painted beauty to his verse, who heaven itself for ornament doth use, and every fair with his fair doth rehearse, making a couplement of proud compare, with sun and moon, with earth and sea's rich gems, with April's firstborn flowers, and all things rare, that heaven's air in this huge rondure hems. O let me, true love, but truly write, and then believe me, my love is as fair as any mother's child, though not so bright as those gold candles fixed in heaven's air. Let them say more that like of hearsay well, I will not praise that purpose not to sell. He'd rather describe his love truly than with false compare, even if his poetry suffers for it. His muse is a person, not a god or goddess, so to write a love poem, he will not call upon Erato, say, the muse of love poetry. There is also no mention of Melpomene, the muse of tragedy, in Hamlet or King Lear, nor Thalia, the muse of comedy in Twelfth Night or A Midsummer Night's Dream. And although he does invoke a muse of fire at the start of Henry V, Shakespeare obviously doesn't bother much with the Greek muses. The ones he writes about tread upon the ground. John Milton, on the other hand, enamoured of the classics and determined to write an epic, couldn't help himself. In Book 7 of Paradise Lost, he invokes the muse of astronomy, Urania, who curiously became the unofficial muse of Christian poetry in the early modern period. Descend from heaven, Urania, by that name if rightly thou art called, whose voice divine, following, above the Olympian hill I saw. But he quickly checks himself, the meaning, not the name I call. As a devout Christian, it would be idolatrous to call upon the name, and he already made sure in Book 1 to invoke his true muse, the Holy Spirit, to help him soar above the Ionian Mount, where the muses dwell. But Milton and those after him, who invoked the classical muses in literature, knew they weren't calling on actual spirits that dwelled on Mount Helicon in Greece, could somehow hear their call from wherever on the planet they happened to be, in whatever language, and grant them the ability to write great poetry in that language. Invoking the muses thus became a mere literary convention, like saying once upon a time conventionally begins a fairy tale. Although the eternal feminine, as Goethe observed, can be difficult to shift in the minds of young male artists in search of fulfillment in the being of a woman whose feet have never trodden the ground, a woman who's never been born, and so can never disappoint them. Perhaps the Virgin Mary gives us some idea of how seriously the ancient Greeks regarded their invocations. Believers may think it an indignity to mention the Mother of God in the same breath as the Muses, yet perhaps no woman has ever been depicted more often in art, prayed to or invoked before an ambitious undertaking, be it to execute a painting, build a cathedral, or go on pilgrimage. More wars have been fought in her name than Mars, let alone Calliope. Still, in the early modern period it was safer for poets to call on Calliope, or some other god or goddess who by then had become mere literary tropes. Presuming to invoke the Virgin for your little poem, imagine Homer, sing in me, O Virgin. Well, that's just an invitation for the Inquisition to set you on fire. By the 17th century, in Northern Europe, especially the Netherlands, the Inquisition held little sway, so grabbing your wife or daughter and dressing her up as a goddess, the Virgin or whoever, was always an option, as Vermeer did in his Art of Painting, in which he features himself with his back to us, painting what some believe is his daughter dressed as Clio, muse of history. There is no muse of painting, as I mentioned. Vermeer has requisitioned his daughter, bearing Clio's accoutrements, a laurel wreath and trumpet, to fulfill the role. But unlike history written down, paint is more perishable. We have the words of Herodotus pretty much as he recorded them, but so few paintings from the ancient world have survived. Marble or bronze may last longer, And yet, perhaps for similar reasons, there's also no muse of sculpture. As Shakespeare wrote, "Not marble nor the gilded monuments of princes shall outlive this powerful rhyme, but you shall shine more bright in these contents than unswept stone besmeared with sluttish time." Perhaps in invoking the muse of history for his painting, Vermeer wanted to overturn this conception that painting, sculpture, and the other plastic arts are doomed to be forgotten far sooner than poetry, literature, and song. But where are the ancient Greek songs? We have fewer musical compositions than crumbling frescoes from the ancient world. Sure, the lyrics survive by Alcman, Anacreon, Archilochus, Sappho, Pindar, among so many others. They were called lyrics because they were accompanied by the lyre. Even the Iliad and the Odyssey would have been sung, and the tragedies and comedies of ancient Greece would have seemed to us more like operas. But none of the music survives. The Pythagoreans may have explained musical tuning, but not a single melody Pythagoras would have heard has survived. Imagine all of 20th century music surviving only as lyrics on a page. True, the ancients still speak to us, but they cannot sing. So what must be done with the musical instruments that are emblems of 6 of the 9 muses? Maybe they were harsh on the painters and sculptors. Even the words of the ancients have relied on the material they're written on for transmission, and the diligence of translators and copyists. And what about terpsichore, the muse of dance? Of all the arts, perhaps the most ephemeral. Dance notation has existed in various forms throughout history, but no one has ever learned to be a Nijinsky, a Martha Graham, or a James Brown by studying dance notation. You learn it by witnessing it directly, imitating it, practicing, making countless mistakes, until the performance seems effortless, and the hours of practice invisible, as if a god or goddess was dancing through you. Recorded technology has changed all this, of course, but like song, nothing survives of ancient Greek dance, except what's depicted on vases, perhaps. So if the end of art is permanence, why over the centuries or millennia has Eratos' guitarra, Euterpe's aulos, Clio's cornet, and Calliope's lyre fallen silent? And after all, what is a muse without music? Of course, this didn't stop poets much later from titling poems songs and not setting them to music. Think of Walt Whitman's Song of Myself. "I celebrate myself and I sing myself," it begins, as if expecting to sing to us from the page, as he and others would have said the Greeks have done, despite the instruments falling silent. Because in the Iliad, for example, even without the lyre, there is music in the words. "Meni naieteteia, pileos Achilleos sulomenen, himurios kaios algeeteke, polas vitimos pisiukai sidi proiapsin, heruoin." Sing, goddess, the wrath of Achilles, etc., etc. One person we know who objected to all this, especially the poetry, was Plato. He had little time for the muses and deemed everything they were associated with as ephemeral because all art is rooted in imitation. The best songs, best singers, best dancers always fall short of perfection. The best sculpture and painting are worse still, for they are imitations of imitations, because the natural world itself is but a shadow of the timeless forms that exist in a realm of pure ideas. The statue of a god is but an inert facsimile of a man. A painting of a bird cannot fly or sing as real birds, let alone ideal, deathless birds in Plato's cloud cuckoo land. "Let no one who is ignorant of geometry enter here," he wrote above the entrance to his academy. He might have objected to there being no muse of mathematics. After all, a mathematical theorem, once proved, is proof for all eternity. And if he did exile the Muses from his republic, he still reserved a special place of honour for their mother, memory. And he famously privileged memory over writing, because writing, again, is only a semblance or imperfect record of what is spoken and what is taught. And writing, moreover, stultifies thinking, because it displaces the role of memory in cultural transmission. If you write it down, you don't need to remember it. Just roll up the scroll and put it on a shelf somewhere. You know where to find it when you need it. Writing it down to moulder on a shelf is a type of forgetting. Ironically enough, his mentor Socrates never wrote anything down, but we only remember what he said because of what others, including Plato, wrote about him. And the fact so many of Plato's works survive after 2,500 years is a testament to the diligence of copyists and translators down the centuries, without which all his idealism would be consigned to oblivion. Not all were so fortunate. Consider Sappho, mentioned earlier, whom the Greeks themselves called the 10th Muse, because she was the only woman listed among the 9 canonical lyric poets. They certainly liked the number 9. A great poet in her own right, she reputedly wrote thousands of lines, of which only fragments survive. And whom did she invoke, being a woman and a lesbian, in both senses, from the island of Lesbos and a lover of women? Why, Aphrodite, of course. Aphrodite, subtle of soul and deathless, daughter of God, weaver of wiles, I pray thee, neither with care, dread mistress, nor with anguish, slay thou my spirit. It seems she wasn't shy about pursuing other women, but she was often jealous of the men who were her rivals in the pursuit. He seems like the god's equal, that man, whoever he is, who takes his seat so close across from you and listens raptly to your lilting voice and lovely laughter, which as it wafts by sets the heart in my ribcage fluttering. As soon as I glance at you a moment, I can't say a thing, and my tongue stiffens into silence. Thin flames underneath my skin prickle and spark. A rush of blood booms in my ears, and then my eyes go dark, and sweat pours coldly over me, and all my body shakes, suddenly sallower than summer grass, and death, I fear and feel, is very near. It's not the canonical 9 Muses that will help her here, who seem to always favour young men, but perhaps the goddess of love, who she calls upon, will be her ally in her pursuit of love and happiness. And in her ode to Aphrodite, the goddess promises, quote, "She that fain would fly, she shall quickly follow. She that now rejects, yet with gifts shall woo thee. She that heeds thee not, soon shall love to madness." And even if women weren't second-class citizens for most of ancient Greek history, one feels female poets wouldn't have invented 9 beautiful female virgins to invoke for their poetic inspiration. They may have chosen male equivalents, others like Sappho, chosen a goddess like Aphrodite to be their ally. I don't think Apollo would be a ready choice, however, despite being the leader of the Muses, and one of the most widely revered and influential of all the ancient Greek and Roman gods. His epithet, Phoebus, means bright or pure. The inventor of the lyre, well, he stole the idea from Hermes, but that's another story. Nonetheless, it's the lyre that the chief muse Calliope held as one of her emblems. Apollo is also said to be beautiful beyond description. Like his twin sister Artemis, he carried a bow, and with it threatened from afar. Thus he was feared as well as revered. He could heal and bring plague. He could give you the gift of prophecy, but at the same time, like Cassandra, ensure no one believes what you say. He could bring inspiration, but also destruction, to those who presume to perform a little too well. However great a poet or musician you think you are, always remember Apollo is number one. So, you see, not the most approachable of gods, which is why, since Homer and Hesiod, he was the god of divine distance, one who threatened from afar, both temporally, through his oracles and prophecies, and spatially, because no matter where on earth you happen to be, you're always within reach of his bow. Beauty, arrogance, and distance. No wonder nymphs tended to flee from him. Most famously, of course, Daphne, a naiad or nymph presiding over fountains, wells, springs, etc. Apollo saw her and was infatuated. She saw him and bolted. And when he was about to catch up, she begged her father, the river god Peneus, to turn her into a laurel tree, which he did. And since Apollo couldn't have her, he took some of her leaves and made a wreath, which would afterwards be used to crown champions at the games, and be worn as a chaplet by generals, athletes, musicians, and Nobel laureates. Laureate for laurel, emblem of victory and unrequited love, or if you're less charitable, of a thwarted rape. Women certainly preferred his bibulous counterpart, Dionysus, but his female followers, or maenads, weren't writing poetry, and while they danced and sang, the nature of their devotion is suggested by the meaning of the word maenad, raving, mad, demented. And if King Pentheus of Thebes can have his head ripped off by his own mother, or Orpheus be dismembered because he refused to entertain these harridans while he mourned his dead wife, perhaps it's best for artists, male and female, to avoid invoking and provoking this god of divine, of vegetation, fertility, insanity, and ritual madness. That said, eventually this feral and unrestrained bloodletting tempered into ritual, and unhinged raving sublimated into song, specifically the dithyramb or hymn in honour of Dionysus. And in his Poetics, Aristotle maintains that in the beginning, tragedy was an improvisation by those who led off the dithyramb. At first it was burlesque in tone, because it contained elements of the satyr play, satyrs being these half-goat men with permanent erections. These plays were the sources of both comedy and tragedy. How they evolved into tragedy is disputed. Some scholars say it was when spoken verse was introduced, and improvisation took a back seat. Eventually the spoken verse was written down before performance, and so less improvisation perhaps meant less slapstick, less comedy, and more serious subjects could be tackled, especially when these newfangled playwrights took the time to develop their stories, their characters, structure their narratives into scenes, acts, protases, epitases, and catastrophe, or simply beginning, middle, and end. The word tragedy means goat song, indicating its origin with the satyrs. The continued association with Dionysus is derived from the fact that tragedy, like ritual, is an outlet for our barbarous tendencies, and the fact that a tragedy is only a play, a performance, gives the savage instinct its release, without the bloodshed. We're not really seeing a woman ripping off her son's head, or Oedipus the king gouging out his eyes after discovering he'd married his mother. When the play ends, we exit the theatre into a world that has not fundamentally changed. The order of the cosmos has not been overturned, but we as spectators have changed somewhat. Aristotle would say for the better. If we watch a tragic love story, say, the sadness we feel at the end is transitory and benign compared with experiencing heartache in real life. Being forced to confront it in a fiction prepares us in a way for the genuine devastation of losing someone you love. Or if you come to a play having already experienced the calamity, it can help you come to terms with your grief. It's reassuring to learn others have experienced these things, and that it's not the end of the world, though it may feel so at first. Or let's say, like me, you enjoy stories of revenge, seeing the wronged protagonist with whom you identify achieve his or her revenge assuages, at least for a while, the continual rage you feel at injustice in the world, and your perception that the wicked seem to prosper at the expense of the good. The word Aristotle uses is catharsis. It means purification or cleansing. He never fully explains it, but many others after him have given their 2 cents. Some have said its role is to restore a proper balance to the emotions. Others go beyond aesthetics and suggest members of the audience are patients to be cured, restored to psychic health. Still others believe the drama should provoke one to political action. Interestingly, the literal medical sense of the word catharsis refers to the release of menstrual fluid, the catamenia, and the fact menstruation was seen as a kind of purification or cleansing of the body and a balancing of the humours makes me think Aristotle believed the same effect occurred in the mind of the spectator, who in the course of the play is purged in a way of their anger and fear, heartache, even despair, and that the effect is ultimately helpful and humanizing. Still, I can't help but think the comparison would make some bristle. I doubt Mnemosyne, the muse of tragedy, menstruated. The gods and goddesses may have had kids, but you never hear about any of them going to the bathroom. And with all this talk of Dionysus, the randy satyrs and crazed maenads, what role for the muse of tragedy herself, Mnemosyne? Her main emblem was the tragic mask which actors wore, the exaggerated expressions defining the characters they played. Masks also allowed actors to play multiple characters. Mnemosyne's counterpart, the muse of comedy, Talia's emblem was the comic mask. Another of her emblems was the shepherd's crook, which was echoed in vaudeville and, of course, cartoons where the crook was used to yank bad performers like Daffy Duck off the stage. In Hamlet, Shakespeare said, "The purpose of playing or acting was and is, quote, to hold, as it were, the mirror up to nature." But of course mirrors can be made to deceive. A contemporary of Shakespeare's, Thomas Coriat, wrote that he witnessed something quite remarkable when he went to the theatre in Venice. Quote, "I saw women act, a thing that I never saw before. Moreover," he says, "they performed it with as good a grace as ever I saw any masculine actor." Of course, in Shakespeare's London, women didn't act, and female characters were played by young boys on the cusp of adolescence, whose voices hadn't cracked. As problematic as this may seem through a 21st century lens, we have to acknowledge these boy actors must have been extraordinary. Imagine a 12 or 13-year-old boy playing Lady Macbeth or Cleopatra. Of course, Shakespeare and his contemporaries fully exploited the fact women were excluded from the stage by playing with the audience's willing suspension of disbelief and showing them a 13-year-old boy dressed as Lady Macbeth snarl convincingly, shockingly, "Come to my woman's breast and take my milk for gall, you murdering ministers." Or in Twelfth Night, Viola, who's disguised as Cesario, so a boy actor playing a girl disguised as a boy, in a scene with the man she loves, Orsino, who expresses doubt that women can love as passionately as men. Viola responds as Cesario, "I know too well what love women to men may owe. In fate, they are as true of heart as we. My father had a daughter loved a man, as it might be, perhaps, were I a woman, I should love your lordship. Were I a woman." Cesario imagining here that he were loving as a woman, so a boy actor dressed as a girl, disguised as a boy, imagining they were a woman. This playful gender bending among men and boys makes it all the more ironic that the Greek muses of tragedy and comedy are traditionally female. Still, I'd love to have seen an Elizabethan performance of a Shakespeare play. But just like ancient choruses and dances and voices, these scenes, these revels, have long since melted into air. Of course, nowadays, even dancing terpsichore can be found in her element in places like Instagram and TikTok. But whereas the art of the ancients suffers for its scarcity, modern art, especially performance art, suffers for its superfluity. It's easier to find a needle in a haystack than a needle in a stack of needles. Around 100 million videos and photos are posted to Instagram each day. How many of these will be viewed again in a decade or a century or a millennium? They'll surely be discoverable on the internet, or whatever version of the internet happens to exist in 1,000 years, for those who want to find them. But of course, kids dancing on TikTok don't do so in order to be admired 10,000 years from now. They want to be admired today. Still, there is a greater likelihood their performances will survive long into the future than be irrevocably lost, like the dancing and singing the ancient muses presided over, or any of the acting seen in Shakespeare's time. Indeed, any performance before the invention of recording technology, and the importance of this relatively new technology, the photograph less than 200 years old, recorded sound just over 100 years old, and film younger still, is reflected by the inclusion of 2 gold phonograph records aboard the Voyager spacecraft launched in 1977. Voyager is currently the farthest human-made object from Earth, roughly 23.5 billion kilometers away, or almost 160 times the distance between the Earth and the Sun, and 8 times farther away from us than the planet Uranus, named after the grandfather of the Muses, and after whom the muse of astronomy, Urania, was named. What would the ancients who worshipped and invoked her have thought of these golden discs now careening through space at 60,000 kilometers an hour? The intention of those who launched it is clear. Carl Sagan said, quote, "The spacecraft will be encountered and the record played only if there are advanced spacefaring civilizations in interstellar space, and the launching of this bottle into the cosmic ocean says something very hopeful about life on this planet." President Jimmy Carter said, "This is a present from a small, distant world, a token of our sounds, our science, our images, our music, our thoughts, and our feelings. We are attempting to survive our time, so we may live into yours." Among the images included on the disc is a photo of Jupiter, the largest planet in our solar system, a picture of a woman breastfeeding, page 6 of Newton's Principia Mathematica, a woman tasting grapes in a supermarket, 4 people racing around a track, an airplane taking off, a physician examining an X-ray, an astronaut in space, the solar spectrum with absorption lines visible, a small tropical island surrounded by blue water, and several children standing around a globe of the earth, examining it intently. Among the sounds, greetings in 55 languages, whale songs, sounds of the earth, Bach's Brandenburg Concerto No. 2, Johnny Be Good by Chuck Berry, Mario Mangi by the Nyora clan of New Guinea, and many other carefully chosen and curated images and songs from around the world, supposed to be representative of what is both ordinary and extraordinary about our species. But even these, should they survive long enough to be picked up by some spacefaring civilization who knows how far away in space or distant in time, perceptive enough to know what to do with this floating bottle and understand the message it contains, the impression they get of us might not be too dissimilar to the impression we now get of the ancients on our world, Greek or otherwise, from the ordinary and extraordinary fragments they've left us. Thanks for listening. I intend to release the other episodes in the Muses series periodically over the coming months, interspersed with episodes on other topics. I thought this was better than doing 9 or 10 straight episodes in the Muses. That said, the first episode proper will be on Calliope, the muse of epic. But before that, I thought I'd talk about a little topic called the Enlightenment and the German philosopher Immanuel Kant's famous answer to the question, what is enlightenment? So do join me next month for that one.